A single action airbrush and a dual action airbrush or a double action airbrush look very different. But what is the difference? The difference is how the brush operates. With a single action airbrush, you press down on the trigger and that activates both your air and the paint flow. So as soon as you press the trigger, paint is going to flow through the brush. I'll demonstrate with just some water. As soon as I press the trigger, I have paint and air coming out of the brush. You can control the volume of the paint with this knob on the back of your single action airbrush. Dialing this knob down decreases the volume, and backing it off increases the volume of the spray. In contrast, a double action airbrush requires two actions in order to operate the brush. Pressing down on the trigger, just like we did with a single action airbrush, activates the air and the air only. You control the volume of the paint by rocking the trigger back and forth. Pulling the trigger farther back releases more volume of paint. Pulling the trigger slightly back releases less volume of paint. Again, I'll demonstrate by placing just a little bit of water in the airbrush cup. So pressing down on the trigger, there's no water flowing out of the brush, it's only air. But if I rock back on the trigger all the way, you can see we now have paint flow, or water flow in this case. Moving the trigger back and forth controls the volume of the paint. I have been an airbrush artist for decades now, and I have always recommended a double action airbrush over a single action airbrush anytime I have ever been asked, regardless of what the person asking the question was into, whether they were into model cars, miniatures, cosplay, fishing lures, or artwork. It doesn't matter. I've always recommended a double action airbrush because I know how both airbrushes work, and I know that inherently the double action airbrush will give the user more control regardless of what they're working on. So if they want to move on to something else later on in life, the double action airbrush is going to serve them well in either situation. I've always had a good understanding of how a single action airbrush works compared to the double action airbrush, but I've never actually used one. I've never owned one, never picked one up, never used one until very recently. And I decided that from a teaching standpoint, if I'm going to recommend one product over another, then I should probably have some level of experience with both products. Obviously, I'm never going to have the same level of experience with a single action airbrush that I do with the double action airbrushes that I've been using for years and years and years. But I can try it, have tried it actually. I've already completed the painting before I filmed this introduction. And I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I thought it might just be a train wreck. It actually turned out better than I thought it would. There are a lot of mistakes. I stumbled a lot along the way, but it is what it is. I was trying to learn a new system. I think my experience with double action airbrushes helped tremendously, but it was still very, very challenging. So what I wound up doing ultimately, I decided to paint an image that I found on the internet years ago. I had it saved on my computer. It's a picture of a skull and a couple of bones underneath it. I tried to find the same image so that I could put a link in the description if any of you wanted to try and paint the same thing, and I had no luck. I apologize for that. Ultimately what I did is I created a sketch based off of that internet image that I had saved on my computer. It's larger, and I did that intentionally because that would give me a little bit of an advantage using an airbrush that I really didn't have a lot of experience, actually zero experience with. So what I wound up doing is I took my sketch and then I traced that sketch on two other sheets of paper the same size. And what that does is it gives me lighter pencil lines. When I'm tracing over my own sketch, I can keep the pencil lines very light. I'm using transparent paint for this demonstration, and that will give me a better shot at covering the pencil lines that I have. So I thought I would paint the same image, one with the single action airbrush and one with a double action airbrush. That way we can kind of compare and contrast the differences, and I can give you my likes, dislikes, where I had issues, where I didn't have issues, things like that. Obviously, I'm going to be somewhat biased toward a double action airbrush because that's what I've used for years and years and years. I wasn't even sure I would be able to create an actual painting with a single action airbrush. It turned out okay. It's not great, and I was never planning on either one of these being an actual finished artwork. I tend to get carried away when I get sucked into something. I still want to try things, and I spent a lot more time on it than I intended. So let's just dive in. The way that this airbrush works is totally different than what I'm used to. So as soon as you press the trigger, you have paint coming out of the brush. So at this point, I want to dial it down as low as I can. You can see you still get some fine lines. Because if you want to make a line, if you just start in one spot, you're going to get that big circle at the beginning. So you can see how I'm constantly moving as I'm pressing the trigger. And this is another no-no. See, I'm pressing the air on and off, on and off, on and off. With a dual action airbrush, you don't do that. You see, I just created a spot right there. So this is very counterintuitive to what I've taught myself to do over the last 30 plus years. So one thing I'm noticing is with the paint really dialed down, where you're just getting a small amount of paint to come through the brush, you don't get those dots quite as bad. I just did another one right there. But I think the key here is to keep the brush moving as you're working the trigger up and down. I think I want to try to outline the bottom of the skull here, and I'm a little apprehensive because it's actually not bad. It's spitting a little bit. That's not a really nice line. It's more dotted. The paint is flowing for a brief moment and then not flowing and then coming back. The other thing that's different with this airbrush is normally I would activate only the air just to kind of dry what paint I've just put down. You can't do that with this airbrush because more paint just keeps coming out of the brush. Oh, and there's a big spot right there. Now here's something else you can do, not only with this brush, but you can do it with a dual action airbrush too. What I'm doing is modulating the air pressure with the trigger alone. So I'm, instead of pushing all the way down on the trigger, I'm just barely pressing on the trigger. And that allows some control Hopefully you can hear the difference on camera. So that's still not super clean for that area, but modulating the air pressure with only the trigger does help to control it from what I can see right here. So I think the key to this kind of to keep moving. The downside is once you turn the paint down so far, and I may be actually turning this with my thumb just as I'm holding the brush. With the paint flow really turned down, sometimes it's coming out and sometimes it's not. You will notice me looking to my left, this direction, many times throughout these videos. The reason behind that is I had the reference image on a tablet set up on my easel, which is directly next to this easel. As you can see, you can still get some detailed lines even with a single action. Again, I think the key is to kind of keep the airbrush moving. If you stay in one spot, you're just going to build circles or dots if you can keep the paint flowing anyway. Maybe tip dry on my needle. That was kind of a delay before the paint actually started flowing, which I'm not a fan of. So weird. Every time you press the trigger, paint just comes out when the brush is working the way it's supposed to, and that would definitely take some getting used to. And it's just like any other airbrush. If you want a really fine line, you've got to get close and turn your paint volume down. If you want a broad sort of shading effect, then you can pull the airbrush back. I'm not sure that there is paint coming out. So that's an advantage with the paint turned pretty far down, is from a distance you're really not putting a lot of paint onto the surface, which can help when it comes to using shading techniques or trying to lightly shade an area. That's too much paint. Yeah, this is absolutely difficult. I think it's more difficult than I really anticipated it actually being. But I think the key, again, is really keeping the brush moving, because you can still get fine lines the trick is really when you want to start a line. So if you notice what I just did there, I started off of the paper, moved onto the paper, and followed that dark line in the eye socket that I had already started creating. And then I dropped down and finished it off. So you can still sort of taper off your stroke like a dagger stroke when you're using your dual action airbrush, just by constantly moving the airbrush and then letting go of the trigger. So this is really a lot like painting with an aerosol spray can. Because as soon as you press down, you're getting paint and the propellant, which in this case is just air from the air compressor. You have the advantage of the control as far as how much paint is actually being pushed out of the brush. And you can modulate the air pressure with the trigger, which is good, but I really like the control that I'm used to with the dual action airbrush. This is, a lot of it is because this is very foreign to me. I'm not used to painting this way. This is the first time I've ever tried to paint with a single action airbrush. I'm sure there are artists out there that use a single action airbrush and create amazing works of art. It's like anything else. If you put the time and the practice in to figure out all the tricks and techniques and what's going to work and what's not, you're going to have more success with it. I think we'll try to move back up here to the top. Let's see. So now I probably need to turn my air, or not my air, but my paint down for maybe slightly more control. So you can see, starting off of the paper, trying to draw all this eye socket outline, which was working relatively well, but now the paint is not really wanting to flow again. I guess on a large area you can just keep the trigger pressed down and allow the paint to flow. You can see I'm working in sort of a circular pattern. Just trying to build this color up slowly. You would want to be careful doing this with a single action airbrush, mainly because, as I stated before, you can't just use the air to dry the paint that you've sprayed, because anytime you're on the trigger, you're actually putting down more paint. So another trick that we can use to create some texture, open this paint up. That might be a little bit much. Is using the Gerald Mendez Texture Effects stencils. This is probably going to be your best bet for creating texture with a single action airbrush. And with a dual action, you can really come in close, and at low pressures, again, I'm modulating the air pressure with just my finger, and you can do the figure eights and squiggly lines and get some texture that way. I really think the texture effect stencils are probably going to be the easier way to accomplish that and the faster way to accomplish that. Oh, that's kind of weird looking. The other downside to this is I can't dry the paint off on my stencil with this airbrush, because this airbrush is going to continuously put more paint onto the stencil if I try to do that. The other advantage to working on paper as opposed to a hard surface or an automotive surface with this airbrush is the paper is absorbent. It's absorbing some of the paint. It's a lot more forgiving compared to a hard surface where if you make a mistake, chances are it's probably going to spider out. And do other things that you really don't want the paint to do when you're trying to create a nice sharp line or defined edge. Again, this area here just needs texture. But it's harder to create that when I can't control the flow, the amount of flow that's coming out of the airbrush with only my finger. By pulling back and forth on the trigger, it makes it much more difficult. You can create some very fine dot texture that way, and it's relatively random, so that's not a terrible thing. But now I need more flow in order to actually airbrush. So we're going to have a little bit of a... God, this is so difficult. A bit of a shadow here. If you can see, I've got the paint turned down enough that every time I'm pressing down on the trigger, sometimes paint is coming out, sometimes it's not, which actually worked out to my advantage as far as trying to create the effect that I wanted right there. But it's still, see right there, the brush was working great, and then it just stopped spraying paint again. And I think it may be a tip dry issue. So now again, I'm not getting paint coming out of the brush consistently. Whoop. That little whoop was my aim was slightly off, and I actually put a darker spot right above where I was aiming. So that's another downside to using a single action airbrush. See, I just went too far on that stroke as well. The control is not the same as what I'm used to, obviously, but you also have to have really good aim when you're using this brush, because as soon as you press the trigger, paint is going to come out, as long as everything is set correctly, which I'm struggling with. So then I'm going to try and create some other texture in here to kind of cover up that little mistake that I just made. Texture stencil can help to kind of hide that. So now with that other texture in there, it's not as noticeable. Just trying to put a little bit of shading into this bone underneath the skull. I don't know how well this is going to translate or fade. The fade is pretty difficult. This would be a lot easier if you were using masking techniques to actually mask off the area up here where you want to keep it a little bit cleaner. I'm not really necessarily looking for a finished artwork for this particular painting. This was more about really just trying something that I've never tried before. And if I'm honest, it's going better than I thought it would. See, now I'm not getting any paint. This is very what's the word I'm looking for here? It's very problematic is not the word. It's very temperamental as far as what I'm able to do, when I'm able to do it. Again, now I want to carry this line, but you see how the paint is spitting little dots? I think that's because I've got the volume turned down probably a little too far. But if you turn it up just a little bit, that's better. I don't think at this point that it's the fact that I don't have the paint reduced enough. I really think it has more to do with just the lack of control that I have with this airbrush. Again, I'm sure there are people out there who've used these for enough time to really get and dial in that solid control, the ability to do pretty much whatever they want. I'm just not that guy. Like you see right here, I'm barely using any air pressure, and it is giving me enough control that I can come in and kind of enhance this crack above the nose socket. And I just spidered it out a little bit right there. Not a huge issue. Now I want a little bit more paint. That's the thing too with this particular airbrush. You can see I just got paint down here where I didn't necessarily want it to be, but I'll try to fix that. What I was starting to say is that's the thing with this particular airbrush is because you're changing the volume of paint with this little knob, when you have it where you want it, like if I'm trying to cover a large area or I want more paint to come out, you have to remember to go back and readjust that when you want less paint. And I'm having some difficulty remembering to readjust that on a regular basis. This side of the skull is really more in shadow. I didn't necessarily want to do that. I do want a dark hole here, and I just screwed that up. Now I have what's probably going to be 2 holes. It is what it is. Sometimes you just have to play the hand you're dealt. Adding some texture there with some small, very out of focus dots. Not necessarily because I was trying to make them out of focus, but because that's what happened with this particular airbrush, because I'm not used to it. I don't have the control that I would really like. That was too dark. I'm trying to add just some striations and shading to the bottom of that nose socket that's still kind of catching a little bit of light, but not necessarily a lot of it. Wow, that didn't work out at all. Spidered that right out. So we'll try to make this hole slightly larger to kind of cover up that mistake. Just as a quick demonstration, you could come in with an eraser, whether it's an electronic eraser or just a regular eraser, and you can add some of your highlights this way, because we're just working on paper. And this is not something that requires a lot. For this particular piece, I would be very subtle with the highlights. I don't want to come in here and erase tons and tons of things. You can add texture though and highlights into the piece, and it's going to help for sure. And if this were something that I was doing, whether it's for myself or for a client, if I intended on creating a finished artwork, I would absolutely probably come in and use some of these erased highlights. Now that we've done it, we'll probably go ahead and continue that to finish it out. So I think at this point, I really want to try to start working on the other side of this eye socket. Of course, there's no paint coming out of my brush now. There we go. Whoops, see how it just spidered out right there? That's not because of my normal mistakes. That was actually because the needle actually touched the surface of the paper. I could feel it touch right there. It happens when you're airbrushing without the protective needle cap on your airbrush. It's just part of it. That's pretty normal for me. I very, very, very rarely airbrush with my needle cap protector on there, because it allows you the ability to get very close to the canvas and create those little bitty tiny lines when you're trying to create detail. Again, now I am barely pressing down on the trigger. This is not the full 20 psi or whatever my air pressure is set at that I told you earlier. This is just a little bit of air, but it's giving me some sense of controllability as far as trying to create fine detail type lines and to fill in these areas where I want them to be dark, but I don't want the entire inner socket to be just black. I want it to have some shadows within shadows and a little bit of highlights and texture and things going on back in here. So that's pretty cool how you can control or have some control over this single action airbrush, just in the respect of how much I'm actually pressing the trigger. Still don't have a lot of paint volume coming out, which is a disadvantage compared to a dual action or a double action airbrush, because then you're modulating that just simply by pulling your finger back and forth on the trigger. It's a lot more difficult to do that on the fly with this design. And part of the reason I choose to start filling in some of the background at a point like this is more so that I can judge the contrast of the rest of the piece, because contrast is relative. You got to remember that. So if we were to render all of the skull before creating the background, it would be very easy to go too dark on the skull in the highlighted areas, because you don't have the background to contrast from the foreground. I hope that makes sense. So having some darker tones in your background, I'm going to open up this flow just a little bit, actually makes it a lot easier. You see there's a spot there, that's a large dot. I was further away from the canvas, so it's not really well defined, but that's from me stopping mid-stroke in one area. Try to disguise that by just creating a lot of dots. I got a little bit of that line right there, should not be there. That was not in my plan. So we might bring this darkness down a little bit farther. See, just modulating the air pressure by barely pressing down on the trigger. I will say this is easier to do with this airbrush compared to the double action airbrush because you're only pressing down on the trigger. You're not pressing down and rocking back on the trigger. So it is a lot easier to do, in my opinion. I've been doing the same thing with my double action airbrushes for 20 years. It's just something that I taught myself to do because, as I mentioned earlier, the Mac valves have not always existed. That was not always a thing. So rather than walking back and forth to your compressor when you want to make minute changes, I just figured out how to actually do it using just my finger on the trigger. Now there's a mistake. I just put a line and a dot right on the front of the skull. So I thought, well, let's throw some other striations over in here to kind of take away from that. That's still pretty stark, and we'll address that here in a little bit. And there are a number of ways that you could go about trying to repair that. Again, you could use an eraser and minimize it that way, or you can add more paint in and around. I will probably go the more paint route. You also have to keep in mind that that is the highlight side. So you don't want to make it too dark when it's the highlight side. So we'll see. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to choose to do to repair that just yet, but we will address it. You remember my little dot that I put there? Kind of need to mask that or create it, make it something else, something different, make it, disguise it, whether we hide it through texture or erasing. Maybe a little bit darker texture, a few little areas. Again, I've changed to a different Gerald Mendez texture effect stencil. And now that little mistake is a lot less visible. In the process, I've also kind of lost that defined edge that we created with the freehand shield. So there's a couple things we could do with that. We could come in with an eraser and bring that highlight back, but I don't know that it needs that much of a highlight. We could also come back in and spray some paint behind that edge in order to push this back a little bit more and redefine that edge. The paint on this airbrush is still opened up quite a bit, so I'm modulating the pressure again. I'm barely pressing the trigger to get a little bit of paint to come out and just push that area back a little bit farther. That's a little bit darker than I think it needs to be, or darker than I would really like for it to be, but it actually kind of matches what we have going on down here a little bit better, so it's not the end of the world. You could come in with your electric eraser, and I don't want to follow this line all the way up. I don't want a highlight going all the way down that edge that we created with that freehand shield, but maybe just a few little marks. And you can even carry that in to the rest of it, just like we did with the airbrush when I was creating those striations. It's not going to hurt anything to throw a couple lines like that with your eraser into the body of the skull. I think we could benefit with some very minor texture as well. So if I practice just a little bit to get to where I can spray just some dots. Oh, I forgot. I've struggled at times with getting this airbrush to spray on a consistent basis. I tend to think that that is either due to or partially due to the fact that I'm experiencing tip dry. I don't think I'm experiencing tip dry. I just messed up again. So let's bring our eraser back in. This is just a pencil eraser, an aggressive pencil eraser. Let's see if we can't clean that up just a little bit. It's obviously still visible. This is an issue when you're working with transparent paint. Now I have a really bright highlighted area around that mistake. The mistake is still there. So again, I'm going to fog a little bit of color into that area. Kind of try and take the eye away from it. Maybe add just a hint more texture in that area, just to disguise it. The mistake is still there, but now it's not as obvious as it was just a moment ago when I actually made it. Something else you can do is create, well, you don't want to throw your stencil on the floor, but you can create some of those striations using your freehand shield too, just by spraying through it as you're moving it up and down. So now I'm going to try and shade some of this. First of all, we need a little bit of shading, and I don't have an outline around the entire eye socket, which is probably better. May not actually want a full-on outline there. Maybe we could use a freehand shield to help us with that. So right now I'm just using the shield really to mask this area right here, to fill in that. Again, the Gestalt principle. So I actually had a small outline going to about that point, and then an outline going to about that point. I've just closed that up using the freehand shield instead of using an outline, but it still looks like an eye socket because my mind is putting what I see into a unified whole picture rather than just looking at this little bitty section. So that was not great, and this is where I really struggle with the control in this particular airbrush, is when you're wanting to make those fine gradated fades in small areas. It's really not that easy to do because you don't have control of when the paint actually starts and stops like you do with a double action airbrush. Again, as I've said before, I'm sure with practice you could get very good at it and you'd be able to create some amazing work. But when you're so used to what you already know, when you've been using the same tools for years and years and years, it's a lot more difficult, I think. To change to another tool. I think same thing. I'm going to come back in with this pencil eraser and just kind of work in random little circles and try to bring in a little bit more of a highlight in some of these areas. can see now I'm pretty much going straight up and down with the eraser. But you can work it in multiple different ways, and that's the key to creating, you know, believable textures. You don't want to create the same pattern over and over and over again. You can even use the more aggressive ink side, but you want it to look very organic and natural, regardless of whether you're trying to paint realistic or not. Creating organic and natural looking texture and patterns in your artwork is going to improve your artwork either way. Same thing like what I was just doing with the brush, with random little lines and striations kind of thrown in there. Just creates a little bit more texture. It's more interest. It's something else for your brain to put together in that whole image. And I said I wasn't really planning on using the eraser on this painting. And it wasn't from the beginning. I kind of thought I would really just primarily be using the airbrush, but it kind of goes along with the same principle that I was talking about with this. Rather, yes, we could have brought the erasers in and lightened this area up instead of darkening the background or what's behind it up. There's no right or wrong answer. And now that we've gone this far, we might as well bring in the electric eraser. Which can be used to kind of break up some of this texture in here that I created with the Texture Effects stencils. That was a little bit too stark. It really looked like that area was stenciled. Just coming in with the electric eraser and just kind of randomly tapping. You can really see how that has really broken that texture up. It looks much better now, in my opinion, I think. It doesn't look so contrived. It doesn't look like I just stuck a stencil on there and sprayed through it. So now we just need to kind of work on this little area right in here. Oh, I got paint all over me. And spilled paint out of the side of the cup, and I've just drug it across my painting surface. So that's awesome. So I've wiped the paint off of my fingers with a paper towel, and now we can come back with the eraser. See if we can break that up any. That's pretty stubborn there. That's really soaked in. And I kind of like to define this bottom edge of the nose socket a little bit better, or a little bit darker, I should say. See, you can still fade strokes out even with the single action airbrush. I am having to concentrate a little bit more to do that than normal because, again, as soon as you press the trigger, paint is flowing, but it can absolutely be done. The key again is to kind of keep the brush moving as you're letting off of the trigger and as you're pressing down on the trigger. That's not what I was trying to do there. That was a mistake. I was wanting to create just like a hole there, and I just not create a hole. I kind of created a dagger stroke. So it's frustrating. Maybe some smaller hints of textures here, but darker. This is something that I would normally do freehand just by creating little dots, similar to what I did right there. But because I'm having the issues with the consistency in this airbrush, I'm leaning against trying to do that. So that's another method that you can use to get some of that, or very similar texture to what I created right there. Try this again. So I'm just trying to create little, again, dot texture with the brush, but it's not, you can hear the air, but the paint is not flowing when the air is on, which is not the way a single action airbrush is supposed to work. So I don't know. I don't have the answer for that. Where I streak that paint there, I'm probably going to try and add a little bit of a crack. That was not it. Wow. This is just going south in a hurry. Let's try and fade that out a little bit. Make it look like it's really an indention going in there. Up here I really wanted like a little hole. That's more what I was trying to create when I created that mistake. And then up in here we need something else, more texture, more lines, something. It needs something. It's a little too sterile. So I'm not crazy about that crack there. That's where my little wiping fresh paint over it happened. Still just using the random kind of patterns to bring highlights back into this. I really hate that crack that I wound up putting in down here trying to cover up my mistake. Probably try to get rid of most of that. Because it really looks stupid. You don't generally see a crack running in that direction on the front of a skull, ever. I might have more luck if I was actually using an aggressive eraser in my electric eraser. I think it's just going to have to be that way because I don't want to really spend an enormous amount of time on it. I mean, we've already spent an enormous amount of time on this particular painting, far longer than, like I said, I really anticipated. I did not. Think this would take as long as it actually has. Some of that has to do with the fact that I was trying to figure out how to use the brush and making many mistakes along the way. And that pretty much wraps up the single action airbrush experiment. What do I think? It wasn't the train wreck that I imagined it was probably going to be before I started. I did struggle. I struggled a lot. You saw I made many mistakes. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. There are some things that I really don't like, and there's some things that I do like. Overall, I think it's a lot darker than I would have liked. Part of that is due to the fact that I was trying to learn how to use the brush for the first time. Part of it was due to the fact that I was trying to cover, minimize, or disguise my many mistakes. It was a struggle for sure. But overall, it turned out well. So can you use a single action airbrush to create artworks? You absolutely can. And with some practice, I'm sure anyone could get far better than what I am. Would I still recommend a double action airbrush over a single action airbrush? Absolutely. That's just what I'm used to. The control you have with a double action airbrush is far greater. So let's move on to the double action comparison. And already there's a huge difference because now I'm actually controlling when I want the paint to be on and when I want the paint to be off. Which in a sense, even with the single action airbrush, you're still in control of when the paint starts because it's as soon as you press down on the trigger, and you're still in control of when the paint stops because it's when you release the pressure on the trigger. But it's far easier to control using a double action airbrush. And part of that, I'm sure, is because that's all I've ever used. It's also the fact that with a double action airbrush, you're kind of the way that you're supposed to use it, or the way we recommend that you use it. You notice while I'm painting, the air is always on now, because once I have the air on, there's no need, unless I'm making those minor adjustments, which is going to be difficult with this brush because it's brand new and that trigger is still pretty stiff. But once the air is on, there's no reason to release the air. All you have to concentrate on is the pulling back and the rocking forward on the trigger in order to control the volume of the paint that you're applying to your project. And for the side of this bone, just Going over it and over it several times. Working on building that dark line to define the bone on, or the side of the bone, but it's still very faded. It's very subtle. It's not sharp. I want it out of focus. And I'm using the same techniques and tactics that I was using with a single action brush. You can start down here off of the page and then rock your way up, working it up and down. Another way that you could do this, if you're not confident with your freehand skills, you know, I generally work pretty much all freehand, and I would encourage all of you to work on your freehand skills, because let's face it, freehand is king. Once you get really good freehand skills, you can pretty much paint anything you want, but you can use a freehand shield to get the same effect. The thing is, you don't want the shield laying right on the surface. You need to keep it elevated off the surface. That's probably about a ½ an inch. And then you just spray along your shield, and it'll give you a very nice faded, soft, subtle edge, similar to what I was going for there. And then you can always pull it back a little bit to get a little bit closer. To what I was aiming at. So I'm a little off there, which is okay. We can fill that back in with just a few strokes. I don't want to make all of this super dark, but I do want some darkness in the background, just like we did in the previous painting, or very similar. It's not going to be obviously exactly the same as what we did before. Maybe here's one thing that I really didn't like in the previous painting. On this line outlining the skull, I came in and traced an outline, or painted an outline across there first. And I didn't like that in the end because it still had that outline there. I want to keep this one a little bit more subtle. So what you can see I'm doing is I'm aiming the airbrush in the direction that I want the overspray to go. This is the background. This is what I'm trying to fill in right now. So I'm just loosely putting a little bit of a blend in this area. And now I have a very soft, not even defined edge for the skull there that we can hopefully make look a little bit better later on. But I don't have that, like I just painted a line going around there. Again, if you notice, the air is always on, which makes it actually so much easier to learn. When you're first starting out, rather than having to concentrate on pressing up and down and rocking forward and backward, if you just leave the air on while you're airbrushing, just keep that trigger finger pressed down. And like I said just a little bit ago, all you have to worry about is moving the trigger back and forth to control the volume of your paint. The rules are all the same regardless of what airbrush you're using. If you want fine lines, you get up close to the surface. If you want broader strokes or lines, you get further away from the surface. Same thing, I wasn't very happy with this area of the bone in the previous painting. I'm going to try to render this a little bit differently now that I have better control of my airbrush. I want a soft edge because that's out of focus. Very similar to what we did up here. I don't want to just necessarily come in here and draw a line to define the edge of that bone. And it's going to take some coats to really get a lot of darkness in there, with this paint reduction ratio being pretty much a 1-to-1. And I really like that 1-to-1 because you can sneak up on your dark areas. The paint is thin, so you can work at low air pressure. Notice how often I'm picking the tip dry off of the needle. There are a lot of pros to using a thin paint mix. Just like I did before, I can actually start off of the paper. If you're concerned about the control you have with your airbrush before you start coming in to fill in that line, it's very easy. Start off of the paper and then just bring the brush on. If you're painting on something, for one, that you can paint on, but you can also see how thin your line is when you're starting off of the surface, so you know if, yeah, that's pretty much where I want to be, or no, that's not at all where I want to be, before you actually bring it onto the surface of your painting. But you can get really good, clean, nice lines just working freehand too, with some practice, obviously. Part of that is the air pressure. My air pressure, again, is pretty low. It's at 20 psi. I actually have a Mac valve on this airbrush that I could adjust it down even lower if I needed to or wanted to. And it's that control. It's keeping the air on at all times. All I'm doing is rocking back and forth on the trigger a very small amount and keeping the brush moving. And when I say I'm rocking the trigger back and forth a very small amount, I mean it's, if the camera will pick this up, actually I have another camera. So hopefully you can see just how much movement I'm making with my finger on the trigger, pulling it back and forth. And it's not a constant, I'm not pulling it back and holding it in one area. You pull it back and forth. You're working the trigger back and forth constantly. Again, drying paint, you can usually see the paint drying on camera when I'm just using air. You don't want to hammer it on. You don't want to put it on too thick, too quickly. It can cause you problems. Sometimes it actually creates texture, which is kind of cool too. Speaking of which, I do want some texture in these areas that you're still going to be able to see. So we can experiment and see if I have better luck creating texture with the airbrush alone, with the dual action airbrush alone, compared to the single action airbrush. So if we want to throw some texture in this area, I'm a little ways back, probably an inch, maybe an inch and a half, barely pulling back on the trigger, and I'm just moving the brush. Kind of random patterns. If you get closer, you're going to get finer lines in your texture. Move further away, you're going to get some broader strokes. But you can absolutely create texture. I'm sure you can create texture with single action airbrush in a similar fashion. I just don't have the experience level to do that. So I'm not trying to say that nobody can create texture with a single action airbrush. That's not it at all. I'm saying I don't have the ability to do it as efficiently as I do with a double action brush. And you can still use your texture effects stencils to create texture as well. Never limit yourself to just one tool or one method. It really makes a huge difference, especially as far as believability is concerned, when you incorporate different tools in your work to create all the different effects that you want to create. I said earlier that when you're working the trigger of the airbrush, your double action control, moving the trigger back and forth. When we were up here in this eye socket filling this in, I'm not necessarily just opening the trigger and pulling back a certain amount and keeping it there. You're constantly working the trigger back and forth, and that's how you control the volume of the paint, when you want the paint applied and when you don't. In instances where I'm tracing over my sketch lines like this and I just want a really dark line, I'm not double actioning in that circumstance. I'm actually just pulling the trigger back just enough to get the desired line that I want, and I'm just holding it there. So I don't want you to misconstrue what I was trying to say. I'm not saying you never pull the trigger back and hold it in the same spot. It all depends on what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish at the time. See, now I'm back to moving the trigger back and forth ever so slightly, just trying to fill in this really dark area. I may move over. Same thing, just trying to begin creating this line. It's not perfect. Really not trying to make it look perfect. I did get a couple little, there's a spider right there, and there's some spidering right down here. Probably because I'm at a pretty good angle here. It's hard for me to see what I'm doing compared to the way that I'm normally working. But the benefit to that is that spidering, because of the way I had the brush aimed when I was painting that line, it's spidering into the portion that's going to be super dark anyway, so it really doesn't matter. Now if I spidered it in this direction, would that have mattered more? Those are very small spiders. By the time you put the other shading and textures that we're going to put into this, it probably really wouldn't be noticeable at all. Again, the point is everybody makes mistakes. I still make mistakes all the time. You're going to make mistakes. You're probably going to make more mistakes when you're first learning comparatively. But your mistakes are just mistakes. Don't let them control your thought process or get you discouraged. Figure out a way to change it to something else, or put texture over it, or erasers. You've got a ton of tools at your disposal. Learning how to deal with those mistakes, whether it's a repair or you're covering it up or making it look like something else, it really doesn't matter. It's just learning how to deal with mistakes, because they're going to happen. They're going to happen throughout your airbrush journey. I don't know of anybody out there that's perfect and just never makes mistakes. I had a lot harder time trying to create just some random textures using only the single action airbrush. With the double action airbrush, you inherently have more control. So you're controlling how much paint is actually coming out and exactly when it's coming out. It makes it a lot easier to come in. And all I'm doing, this is again another one of those cases where I've actually got the trigger pulled back to one spot and I'm just holding it there. I'm randomly just kind of moving the airbrush around, shaking it around to create a little bit of texture into this background. Same thing. Get closer, you're gonna get darker texture and finer lines. Those were not exactly what I was trying to do. I was thinking about demonstrating getting closer without thinking about the consequences behind that. So I didn't necessarily want this little wavy line right there or that really dark line. That's a product of holding the paint open in one spot and just keeping it there versus working the dual action trigger. And that was another little mess up there. So we can also create texture just like we did in the other painting with the single action airbrush using some of the Gerald Mendez Texture Effect stencils. But just blowing paint through very lightly the open areas of these stencils while you're moving them around. Oops, got caught on there. Again, it's always a good idea to use some different stencils for different texture effects. A little bit more right there in this area. And now, you know, you really don't see, I still see that spot right there that I made unintentionally, but now it sort of fades into the texture that's been created around in the surrounding area. Same thing with that little wavy line that I created in there. I really don't see that anymore. So we've managed to cover those up with just a few little strokes. Now, one of the downsides to doing all that when I did is now I've sort of lost my sketch line for that line going over between the eyes and over the bridge of the nose. So I will have to see if I can figure out where that line's supposed to be. First of all, I know the center of it, I can still very faintly see it. And that's another thing with, you know, painting a skull. You can ad-lib quite a bit, especially once you've done a lot of these. Not every skull is created the same. So we had the little holes over here that I struggled with to render with the single action airbrush. Dual action airbrush makes it much, much easier. Same thing, this one, there's kind of that indented hole. So we'll kind of fade this out to really make it look like it's sort of sweeping back into that area. And I got a little bit overspray on that edge there. I don't think it's going to matter a whole lot because this is the shadow side, but if you want to clean it up, an eraser makes very quick work of that. Another option for creating little indentions like that is to use a freehand shield, especially on paper where you don't necessarily, you may not want to put a masking material over the surface. You find a freehand shield with something close to that shape, and that's actually closer than I thought it was going to be. You can lay a freehand shield over your work. Now, I don't obviously want to spray completely around this shape. I just want to hit one little tight area. Make sure you dry it before you pull it away. Right now I'm just spraying air. And you see how that gives you a pretty sharp defined edge on that right edge. But I was only spraying kind of in this one little bitty area on the actual shield. If you spray all the way around it, you're just going to have a big mess there. So I think we can bring a little bit of a line up right in here. This is where the double action airbrush really shines as well, because previously, you know, when we were working with the single action airbrush, when I was trying to create an outline like that, or a fine line like that, remember I was starting in a really dark area or off the paper before I came into it. Having the ability to really control exactly where the paint starts and stops and how much paint is going to come out of the airbrush simply by moving my trigger finger back and forth on the airbrush is a huge advantage when it comes to that kind of control. So rather than trying to find a dark area down here which doesn't exist yet, and I'm not sure that it will, when I started that stroke, I was pretty confident that I could come in and just start that stroke right there without too many worries. Now if I do screw it up, it's not the end of the world. We can still repair a mistake when they happen. But the level of control that you have with a double action airbrush, it's hard to understate that. Here's another thing that I struggled with in the previous painting. In the reference image, obviously this bone, it's very out of focus, but there is a slight secondary highlight in this area right here. I found it very difficult to render that with a single action airbrush because I was lacking control. I actually used an eraser stroke to kind of just barely bring that back in on the other painting. This one, because I have a little bit more control, I can just do that with the airbrush and the airbrush alone. Not trying to create outlines. There is a little bit of an outline there, but it's pretty subtle. It's broad, and the reason it's broad is because I was pretty far back. I was probably 3-4 inches back when I created that line with my airbrush. I think that's looking okay for where we're at now. Before I get too carried away working down here, I think we need to bring in some color up on this side of the skull. This is one area that I was really very unhappy with in the single action airbrush painting. I really got a super dark line going all the way across here. That should not have been that way. It turned out that way because I was having trouble controlling the airbrush, and that's kind of just the way it wound up. It is what it is, but I don't want to repeat the same thing on this painting. I want some shading over in here and some texture, just similar to what we have up in here, but I don't want that super dark line. There is a crack running about right there, and that's really all we need. That's dark enough, I think. I don't need to go over it several more times. And then there were some darker sort of shaded areas right in this area on the reference. But there shouldn't be just a defined, really dark line going all the way across there. So really what needs to happen is there is a little bit of a ridge there, so we need some shading about like that, just to make this look like it's a little bit rolled over. It doesn't need a lot. And I'm okay with a little more in the corner, but I don't want to carry that all the way up into this section between the nose and the eye socket like I did in the previous painting. So I would like to do some just streaks in here. Just another form of texture. Very lightly. I'm 2 or 3 inches away, barely pulling back on the airbrush trigger. I don't want a lot of paint coming out to do this. I want just a little bit. There is going to be that crack there in the center with what was supposed to be only 1 hole in the previous painting, but it wound up being 2. So let's see if I can't make it just 1 this time. There we go. I would really like to throw some minor dot texture in here. And because this airbrush trigger is so stiff, it's hard to do that. So what I've done is I pulled the airbrush trigger back and I'm holding it in the same spot. There's barely any paint coming out, as you can see, and then I'm just randomly shaking my hand around to create some more textures. And again, that's just using another tool to create texture. You can use different texture stencils too. I have tons of them. I was just trying to keep this video, the series, a little bit more on the simplistic side, I guess. I think we could put a little bit more of a shadow right in here. Again, I don't want a dark line going all the way across here. I want it to be darker here on this end, which we can push a little bit more darkness in right there. And I want it to be pretty dark in here because that's really the rolled over section between the nose socket and the eye socket. But I don't want it to go all the way across like I did in the previous painting. That was a mistake that every time I looked at it, I was like, God, that looks terrible. So let me know in the comments if you saw the same thing and thought, why is this guy trying to teach me how to do anything? And you can put some other fine lines kind of coming down in here just for extra textures and things. You can even bring them up from down below. Take the eraser and bring back your highlights. Same thing down here. Just bringing in the eraser and randomly tapping, just like we did in the previous painting, just to bring back some minor highlights. I'm not trying to bring back every single highlight. Just like we created striations with the airbrush, you can do the same thing with the eraser. Random patterns. Reinforce those there that we pushed back before. Maybe just a hint of darker areas in these shadows down here. but fading them up. I'm not just creating a line, trying to kind of pull. You're pushing and pulling, constantly pushing and pulling when you're airbrushing. You're pushing things back when you're working. Oh, that was a complete wreck right there. What did I just do? Again, this airbrush is not as good at controlling this airbrush as I am the other airbrushes that I generally choose to work with. So I was trying to create some small dot textures off in there, and I wound up creating a big old mess. So let's just try to turn it into something else. Kind of turned it into a little bit of a crack. Maybe take one of the texture effect stencils and create some of that dot texture that I was trying to create with the airbrush alone, kind of around it. I don't know that's really helping my case here. Maybe push that back into shadow a little bit more. Could we erase that and then come back in? You can. Here's the problem with working with transparent paints, because all of this has already been shaded pretty heavily to begin with. You're going to create some really bright highlights in order to get that paint removed. I don't want to erase in the shadow over here that we've already created. I just want to erase in that area that I just completely screwed up. Maybe even outline it with the eraser. And similar to the airbrush, I'm trying to blend it up into the erased highlights that we already had established up here. That's not horrible, but then you need to come back in with paint and push that back again. And you want to be careful. I don't want to push the shadow underneath or on this side further down or further to the right. I just want to push this area back, so I can get a little bit closer, kind of make that edge a little bit foggier. And then just kind of push it back with a very light layer of paint. That mistake is still there. And what I tried to do previously, it's still there. But it is diminished some now. Now it actually looks like it might have been intentional. You and I know it's not. It wasn't. But it's not absolutely horrible. It looks okay. And 90% of the people, you know, the Gestalt Principle, again, when they're looking at this, they're going to be looking at the image as a whole. Their brain is going to take everything they see and put it into one image. They're not looking at, oh, well, look at this. That doesn't look very good at all. It may not look very good in my eye or your eye if it's your mistake, but it actually doesn't look absolutely horrible either. It's not bad. Something else we can do, we can use a freehand shield. I want to kind of push this side, being on the shadowed side, I want to push that back just a little bit more, but I'd like to protect kind of the area around that that's more in highlight. So the shield can help us do that. Just putting a little bit of paint lightly in that area, kind of push it back. Notice this shield, this curve did not fit that shape specifically the way that it's painted, but just lightly throwing a little bit of color in there, it works fine. If you get a little bit outside the lines, it's fine. I'm not throwing a ton of paint. If you come in and you put a lot of paint down, yeah, you're absolutely going to see the line of your freehand shield. But spraying very lightly in very strategic areas, you can minimize that. I think we need some shading on this side of this little arched broken area here. Maybe some minor dot texture down in here. That's working better with this airbrush. Again, it's a brand new airbrush. I'm about out of paint already. And sometimes it takes using the brush to get things broken in and smoothed out. It's still pretty firm, but it will loosen up over time, and I may do some other things to kind of help that along. In the future, I will do a full-on review of this Gallery Mobius 0.2. This airbrush tip is actually slightly smaller than the needle and nozzle that we were using with the single action airbrush as well. At this point, I think we really need to start getting this other eye socket established. Once again, I've sort of lost my sketch lines, which is kind of a detriment to using very faint, thin lines when you're tracing something. It's important when you're using transparents especially, just to be able to hide those pencil lines. With opaques, they can be a little bit darker, but the opaques are going to cover them just like transparents do. So that's something you just have to be prepared for. It's one thing that a lot of comments on my project and trace video. And this is kind of showing my point as well as a lot of viewpoints from others that have watched that video. Is it's not so much about the tracing, it's about finishing the artwork. Because when you start covering all those traced lines, even if you don't trace it, if you just drew this, I mean, I sketched this out on my own. I didn't have to trace it. I traced my sketch for the paintings, but it's very easy to get off track when you start covering your pencil lines, whether you've traced it or you drew it on there freehand, doesn't matter. Once you start covering those lines, it's very easy to get off track and get your proportion off kilter. Obviously, that can have detrimental effects depending on what you're working on. You know, if you're working on a portrait, there might need to be a lot of repair. I recently did the same thing on a Heath Ledger Joker panel that I painted for my actual paint stand. I started it out and had lines established on the panel that I was painting, but it didn't take long before I started covering those lines, and then I kind of got lost, and it took me a little while. I had to make several corrections in order to bring that back to where it needed to be, because for a while there it didn't look like Heath Ledger at all. And that's not, you know, if you're going to be a portrait artist, a big part of that is making the portraits you paint look like the actual people that you are painting. And then where I screwed up in the previous painting, similar to this side over here, there's kind of a secondary highlight on the edge, and then it's darker right next to that highlight. I had a really hard time trying to figure out how to do that. Actually, I completely failed at doing that with the single action airbrush. I think with a dual action airbrush, I will have better success. So it kind of has this shaded area here, and it kind of has a little kick out in the reference there. And then this is all pretty dark. Again, I'm still a little too bright in this area right here. It needs to be pushed back. Just kind of blending this really dark area out a little bit. Let me take a step back and have a look at that. Yeah, I think that looks much better. I won't have to come in with an eraser and bring back this little highlight or secondary highlight on that bone. I think that it's super soft, it's super out of focus. That's exactly what I was going for. I just wasn't able to achieve it with a single action airbrush because I don't have the experience with that brush. I think it needs a little bit more of a shadow directly under the skull. And I think that's good enough. When the mistakes happen, because they do happen, they happen to me. And you've seen, I haven't had as many mistakes, I don't think, painting this one with the dual action airbrush. But man, I still make mistakes. I still make mistakes all the time. So let's do the same thing that we did previously, using a freehand shield just to kind of, actually I might do it the opposite. Just to kind of establish that line on the skull. That might be a little bit off. Probably needs to be a little more this direction. So speaking of mistakes, what did I just do? I tried to correct myself with the shield, and now there's a slight line there. Well, how do we get rid of that? I'm going to suggest texture. I'm not saying it's going to work, but it's probably going to help. Try the shield. Yeah, you can still see it. It's not as noticeable, but it's definitely still there. Now we've kind of creeped into our highlighted area with that texture as well. That's not a huge deal. We're going to want texture in this area just like we did before, but we can come in with our electric eraser and kind of reestablish some of this stuff too, because I'm a little off there. And again, it's not that I'm trying to erase this entire line like I'm doing right here. I still want to create texture. Still want to move, well, not behind the paper. I want the eraser on the paper. I still want to move in a random fashion, create texture in here. And I don't want just a defined edge going all the way down like I kind of have right now. We could even come back in. And create some texture with highlights in all these little areas where we have this overspray. It's up to you as the artist. These are not hard and fast rules. There's not a right way or wrong way to do this. I'm just having fun. But I would probably do the same thing that we did in the previous painting, because this is pretty muddy and not great. Let's just push this back. With some paint. Not following it all the way up. I just want this corner down here that would theoretically be more in shadow to be pushed back. Right off my freehand shield. Now I have another issue. That's an angle that you're not going to see normally. So we'll just come in freehand and kind of round that back out. Push this all the way in the background. And that's going to be dark, dark, dark. So now this portion of the skull right behind, make sure that's dry before I go touching it, here is in complete shadow. That's 100% saturation there. But then it starts reappearing as the light hits it. Again, the texture stencils are really invaluable. You can put textures down so much faster using these stencils. Again, use a variety of tools. Don't rely on just the texture effects stencils. Texture effects stencils. But I mean, that just took, what, 15 seconds? And we've got quite a bit of texture built in. To this piece. We can do the same thing that we did on the other side, kind of, you know, some very faint, fine lines to create some more textures. And this is far easier to do with a double action airbrush, in my opinion, than it was with the single action airbrush. Probably come in with the eraser and pick up some of these highlights. Again, random patterns. This is that area where I didn't like that outline I had on the previous version with the single action airbrush. Now you can see that we've established a background. can really come in with the eraser and establish the highlights in the foreground. And that gives you kind of that defined edge of the cheekbone or whatever it is there without creating that painted line that I had before. Man, you know, it's not absolutely horrible, but I really don't think it looks spectacularly better than what I did with the single action brush. I'm spending roughly the same amount of time on each. Using the same techniques and not spending an enormous amount of time on either. Wasn't crazy about that. But I don't think there's a huge difference as far as the quality of artwork that you can put out with either brush. Obviously, that's going to depend on the user and their level of experience. A small part of me would like to spend more time on the double action brush just to prove a point, but I don't know that I'm really proving a point if it's not true. The single action airbrush skull turned out, I think, just as good as this one did. Either one of them could absolutely be better if I spent more time on them. At this point, I'm just kind of throwing in little touches, changes, things. You know, the one thing I think that would make this look a little more symmetrical that I didn't do on the previous painting, and I think the reason I didn't do it is because I went a little bit darker in this section right here than I did previously. Maybe throwing a little bit of that shading over on this side, which is again something you don't see in the reference image. Doesn't mean you can't put it in there. You can use artistic license anytime you want. After standing back and looking at it just for a second, I think it needs a little bit more of a shadow underneath this nose socket as well. On the shadowed side, using a freehand shield, could easily throw some more shading in there. Couple darker lines. Yeah. I think we'll call this one finished. And there you have it, the single action version and the double action version side by side for comparison. Again, I don't think either one of them turned out terrible. And with a little more time, or maybe concentrating a little bit more, either one of them could be improved farther. I spent about the same amount of time on each painting, so there was no bias as far as the time was concerned. Obviously, I didn't paint them exactly the same. This one, the cheekbone here, has a little bit different shape, and that was really because I lost my pencil lines when I was painting it. I also changed it up down here and did a little bit more of a stylized version that I like to do when I paint skulls. But aside from that, they're both pretty similar. I have likes and dislikes with both of them. The eye sockets on the double action airbrush, I got a little bit too dark in those, that I would prefer to be able to see some more of what's back there like you can in the single action version. It's a little bit dark up here, darker, much darker than I would have liked it. But overall, I think I really had to rely on erasers far less with the double action airbrush version than I did the single action airbrush version. And again, that comes down to I was struggling trying to control the single action airbrush because it's just not what I'm used to. The absolute biggest thing that I noticed between these two paintings is the double action airbrush version seems to be smoother compared to the single action airbrush version. When I say that, I'm not saying that the single action airbrush doesn't atomize paint well compared to the double action airbrush. It does. It atomizes paint just as good as the double action airbrush did. I think it comes down to the application process, and my experience probably plays a role in that. It's just a lot easier to apply your paint very evenly, very gradated when you need to. It's just smoother with the double action airbrush because you have more control over when the paint stops and starts and how much volume you're actually spraying. With the single action airbrush, I struggled. It was more difficult to get smooth gradations because I'm just not used to using the brush. And it's also a product of, I think, the way that the brush is designed. It's really not designed for this purpose. I did actually try to level the playing field somewhat by using the Gallery Mobius 0.2 airbrush on the double action airbrush painting. That's a brand new airbrush to me. I had never used it until I painted this one. So obviously I'm used to using a double action airbrush, but this is a brand new brush. It needs to be broken in a little bit. So I struggled with it a little bit more than I would have if I'd used one of the airbrushes that I've used for years and years and years. Again, I'll do a full review on that brush after I get some more time behind it, but so far I do like it. At the end of the day, I'm still going to recommend a double action airbrush over a single action airbrush to anybody that asks, simply because you inherently have more control with the double action airbrush. It offers so much more versatility when you look at how each brush is controlled, and it will serve you well later on down the road if you decide to branch out into something else. No matter what it is, the double action airbrush will always be a good choice. So I hope all of that makes sense. I hope you got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'll leave affiliate links in the description below to all of the products that I use throughout both of these paintings. I kept it pretty simple on this one. There's not a lot of stencils and other things that I sometimes use in other videos. So until next time, I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio. I'll see you guys next time.